I assumed that the horrors of the African slave trade was the sole responsibility of Christian Europeans or the white race. But further reading and study revealed a totally new perspective and understanding. Millions of people across the world are totally ignorant to the actual facts and have no conception of the sub-Saharan slave trade and the role the Muslim settlers played in enforcing slavery. What I am saying is that the most inhumane and genocidal aspects of the black African slave trade was initiated, refined and perpetrated by Arab Muslims, and then aided and abetted by black converts to Islam. Slavery, as we know, was not created by whites and has been around for thousands of years and still exists today. The European transatlantic slave trade lasted for over 3 centuries, whilst in contrast the Arab slave trade lasted for over 12 centuries. Islamic laws allowed slavery but prohibited slavery involving other Muslims. As a result of this, they attacked non-Muslim groups in Africa and then captured them into slavery. Ibn Khaldun, a preeminent medieval historian, wrote, and I quote, "The Negro nations are as a rule submissive to slavery because they have attributes that are similar to dumb animals. It should also be noted that black slaves were castrated based on the assumptions that blacks had an ungovernable sexual appetite. When the Fatimid Caliphate came to power in Egypt, they killed all the tens of thousands of black military slaves and raised an entirely new slave army. Some of the same people that were drafted in the army were aged just 10 years old. Slave armies with up to 50,000 soldiers became commonplace." Now, what I'm going to explain is some of the differences between transatlantic slavery and sub-Saharan slavery. So with transatlantic slavery, 2 out of 3 of every slaves that were shipped across the Atlantic were men. This proportion was reversed in the Islamic slave trade. 2 women for every man. The mortality rate for slaves being transported across the Atlantic was as high as 10%, whilst the percentage of slaves dying in transit in the trans-Saharan and East African slave market was a staggering 80%. That's a 1 in 5 survival rate. Almost all the slaves shipped across the transatlantic were therefore agricultural work. Most of the slaves destined for the Muslim Middle East were used for sexual exploitation and military service. Very few descendants of the Arab slave trade have survived, as opposed to the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. In 1814, the Swiss explorer Johann Burckhardt wrote, and I quote, "I may venture to state that very few female slaves who have passed their 10th year reach Egypt or Arabia in a state of virginity." David Livingstone, the 18th century abolitionist, he wrote of the slave trade, and once again I quote, "To overdraw its evils is a single impossibility. We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body and lying on the pathway. Onlookers said that an Arab passed early that morning and had done it in anger at losing the price he had given for her because she was unable to walk any longer. We passed a woman tied by the neck to a tree and dead." Let's remember that this happened from the 8th and 9th centuries right up to the 19th century. Now, the following things I'm about to read come from David Livingstone, the 18th century abolitionist, and they paint a very vivid depiction of what the conditions were like during the sub-Saharan slave trade. And this may be a bit graphic for some of our younger listeners, but it's important that we understand exactly the horrors that were perpetuated and how human life was treated. So once again, this is from David Livingstone, the 18th century abolitionist. "Wherever we took a walk, human skeletons were seen in every direction. The site of this desert but 18 months ago, a well-peopled valley, now literally strewn with human bones, forced the conviction on us that the destruction of human life from the Middle Passage, however great, constitutes but a small portion of that waste. Now, the Middle Passage is the journey from Africa to America, many of who died among the journey. Now, what David Livingstone is saying is that no matter how many died during the Middle Passage, it pales in comparison to the number of slaves who died in the process of taking slaves. He goes on to say, they rescued a small group of slaves. Many of the party were children about 5 years or even less. 2 women had been shot the day before for attempting to take their thongs off so that they might rest. 1 woman had her infant's brains knocked out because she couldn't carry both it and her load. And a young man was dispatched with an axe because he had broken down with fatigue. We passed a slave woman shot or stabbed through the body, lying on the path. Not more than 1 in 5 ever reached the kind masters in Cuba. Now, this is quite ironic because we need to remember that David Livingstone is an abolitionist. So when he talks about kind masters, it's quite ironic. But when we think about it, the conditions that they were facing in the sub-Saharan slave trade compared to those conditions that they were facing in Cuba were very different. So we had a situation where 1 in 5 survived, collateral damage of 80%. Now, Mr. Livingstone goes on to say, we had a long discussion about the slave trade. The Arabs have told the chiefs that our own object in capturing slaves is to get into our possession and make them our own religion. The evils we have seen, the skulls, the ruined villages, the numbers who perish on their way to the coast in the sea, the wholesale murder committed by the Wayuu tribe, who were allies with the Muslims to build up Arab villages elsewhere. So what we find is that they are capturing men to convert them to their religion, and also in order to get money and wealth so that they can take it back to their villages. Now, Mr. Livingstone goes on to say, the strangest disease I have seen in this country really seems to be brokenheartedness, and it attacks free men who have been captured and made slaves. They ascribe their pain to their heart. It really seems a broken heart is the reason that they died. The Arabs would often promise a present to the villagers if they would act as a guide to some distant point. But as soon as they were far enough away from their friends, they were seized and penned into the slave sticks from which there was no escape. Now, when I first discovered this information, it shook me to the core. My whole conception of black history had unraveled. It became my quest to share this information because the schools don't talk about it, and neither does Hollywood. Now, we can't let the legacy of our ancestors be disrespected by teaching ourselves an edited version of history. Now that you know this information, what are you going to do with it? How are you going to take action? Will you join the campaign in getting a holistic teaching of world history in our schools? Will you sign up to the petition? Will you share this with a friend? Will you open up the discussion? Will you speak with your history teacher and actually question them on some of the things that you're being taught? Will you ask who is actually putting together this so-called national curriculum? Do your own research. I've given you the books that you can explore. Do you not believe me? Challenge me. Get involved in the conversation. Do your own research. But whatever you do, just make sure that you take action.